What happens to a mind that learns from its earliest days that safety is a myth and connection is a risk, not metaphorically but literally? What kind of internal world forms when a child is abandoned by her parents, then raised by a man who offers neither care nor protection, only control and cruelty? Aileen Wuornos didn't emerge in headlines fully formed. Long before she murdered 7 men in the span of just over a year, long before she stood before the cameras with cold eyes and clipped words, she was a child, one whose reality offered no safe place to land. Her crimes shocked the world. 7 homicides, all committed along Florida highways, carried out with a calm that defied expectation. But before the violence came the silence, a silence shaped by years of being unseen, unheard, unwanted. This is where her psychological script began, not with rage but with absence. And what filled that absence would come to define her. Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? Stay with me. The truths we are about to uncover go deeper than you might expect, because this story doesn't begin with a weapon in her hand. It begins much earlier, in the emotional void where identity was supposed to take shape. And in that void, we find the first rupture. Let's look closer at what happens when the foundational structures of human connection are broken before they're ever fully built. The absence of attachment doesn't just leave a gap. It forces the mind to build alternative pathways for survival. For Aileen Wuornos, those early years weren't simply difficult, they were formative in a way most people never experience. Abandonment wasn't a moment, it was a climate. Her mother left when she was just an infant. Her father, a convicted sex offender, took his own life while incarcerated. And so she was handed off to her grandparents, where the absence of nurturing only deepened. Reports of physical abuse, emotional neglect, and humiliation shaped her earliest internal dialogues. When a child learns that trust leads to pain and dependence leads to rejection, what kind of identity takes root? Have you ever recognized fragments of these patterns in ordinary people? Share your perception. Your voice matters here. And if you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This space was built to explore, not to excuse, to question with honesty and depth what others prefer to simplify. If you're already with us, double-check your subscription so you don't miss the rest of this case. Now let's go even deeper into the next phase of this mind's evolution, not the moment of violence, but the moments that repeated what came before it. Because for some, survival becomes a pattern, and patterns, when left unchallenged, become identity. After being cast out by her grandparents at just 15, Aileen Wuornos began living in the woods behind their house. That moment wasn't just a turning point, it was a reenactment. Rejection returned, not as an isolated event, but as a cycle. From that point on, her interactions with the world were shaped by a relentless need for survival and a learned expectation of abandonment. She hitchhiked, slept outdoors, and engaged in transactional sex, not with malice, but with the precision of someone who had no other internal model for connection. Psychologically, this is what's known as repetition compulsion, a subconscious drive to recreate earlier trauma in an attempt to gain mastery over it. But for someone without guidance, without a repaired mirror of healthy relationships, that cycle only deepens. Wuornos wasn't reacting randomly. She was responding to a world that had always rejected her. Arrest records from her early 20s show a string of petty crimes: theft, assault, disorderly conduct. But what ties these incidents together isn't criminal intent. It's the pattern of someone testing the edges of visibility, of significance. At one point, she reportedly said, "It was survival. I took care of myself the only way I knew how." That sentence reveals more than desperation. It shows a belief system. When the mind accepts instability as its baseline, survival becomes a rehearsed response. And when rejection is expected, emotional detachment becomes protection. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here. It becomes more defined in the repetition, in the quiet decisions that no longer feel like choices at all. If this analysis sparked something inside you, leave in the comments. There's always a hidden layer. But there's another hidden layer we need to uncover, one that reveals how emotional detachment doesn't begin in violence, but in prolonged, quiet instability. Aileen Wuornos didn't suddenly become numb. That detachment was forged over years, in moments too small to be documented, but too consistent to ignore. From an early age, she learned that emotional vulnerability had consequences. Comfort was unreliable. People left. Pain stayed, and slowly her internal wiring began to change. Trust wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Before the murders, this shift had already surfaced. In minor arrests during the 1980s, officers reported her as uncooperative, erratic, emotionally distant. In one instance, after being charged with assault, she refused to explain what had happened and instead stared straight ahead, silent, not in confusion, but in control. Later, in a separate charge for disorderly intoxication, witnesses described her as completely indifferent, even as she was being restrained. These aren't just behavioral outbursts. They're expressions of a system built to protect itself from internal collapse. Emotion had been replaced with function. Feeling became risk. Reaction became defense. Over time, this defense calcified into identity. The persona she carried, defiant, cold, detached, wasn't just for others, it was for herself. A mask so practiced that it became part of the skin. When asked in court why she killed, Wuornos answered, "I was tired of being hurt." That's not an excuse. It's a glimpse into a transformation that started long before any weapon was drawn. In her world, control wasn't about dominance, it was about not being destroyed. And the mind, once rewired to survive in this way, doesn't easily return to softness. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here. It only becomes more precise in its emotional silence. In fact, the deeper we go, the more we find that Aileen Wuornos wasn't just responding to life's violence. She was becoming what the world already expected her to be. From an early age, she was branded runaway, prostitute, unstable, dangerous. And those labels didn't just define her in the eyes of society. Over time, they became the script she lived by. This is the psychology of identity collapse, when the self is no longer shaped by authentic experience, but by external condemnation. When the mirror held up by the world reflects only rejection, rage begins to build without direction, without target, without end. Psychiatrists reviewing Wuornos's case highlighted a form of identity foreclosure, a premature commitment to roles imposed from outside with no exploration of self. One psychiatrist noted during her trial, she didn't believe she had the right to be anything other than what people assumed she already was. In courtroom footage, Wuornos once muttered under her breath, "They want a monster? I'll be the monster." That's not theatrical defiance. That's resignation to a role she believed she could no longer rewrite. This psychological vacuum, where identity is stripped of complexity, leaves space only for survival and sometimes destruction. In the absence of belonging, some individuals stop seeking connection altogether and begin performing the identity projected onto them. And when that identity is criminal, dangerous, or monstrous, the outcome can follow suit. The transformation is quiet but deadly. The mind stops asking, "Who am I?" and starts executing what they already believe I am. And from that space, rage doesn't explode, it calcifies. The mind becomes its own cage, and every act that follows seems, to that psyche, not just permissible, but inevitable. Now let's go even deeper into this, into the rare space where clinical language attempts to decode chaos. During the psychiatric evaluations conducted before and during Aileen Wuornos's trial, the conclusions were both revealing and unsettling. She was not classified as a psychopath in the traditional clinical sense. Instead, several mental health professionals diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder with overlapping antisocial traits. This diagnosis carries with it a painful core, an identity shaped not by cold calculation, but by emotional volatility, abandonment trauma, and a distorted sense of self desperately seeking protection through control. The experts described her as impulsive, emotionally dysregulated, and consumed by an overwhelming fear of being betrayed or discarded. One psychiatrist testified she would rather destroy a connection than risk being left behind in it. That single line echoes through her timeline, from her volatile relationships to the calculated violence that seemed, paradoxically, driven by both desperation and certainty. In her own words during an interview, Wuornos said, "I was tired of being raped. I'd rather be the one who ends it." And there is no peace in that statement. Only a mental survival mechanism shaped by years of repetition, rejection, and unhealed trauma. But here's where the contradiction sharpens. How does a mind so fractured still operate with such lethal clarity? The killings were not chaotic outbursts. They followed patterns, location, timing, approach. This juxtaposition between emotional fragmentation and behavioral precision is what made her case so psychologically complex. It suggests a mental compartmentalization so intense that emotion and action no longer spoke the same language. Behind the outbursts was an internal structure, however unstable, that allowed her to function and even hunt with terrifying focus. The truth hidden in this structure isn't about evil, it's about adaptation, pushed far beyond the threshold of empathy, into a mental space where survival was no longer about living, but about not losing control. The complexity of this mind doesn't end in the courtroom. In fact, it took on new shapes as the sentencing phase began. Aileen Wuornos was ultimately convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to death for each of them, one after another. The courtroom became a stage not just for legal procedure, but for public spectacle. Cameras captured her defiance, her erratic statements, her moments of eerie calm. But underneath the surface, there was something unraveling, a final transformation, not from innocence to guilt, but from psychological tension to total collapse. In the final stretch of her life, Wuornos's behavior took on a more paranoid tone. She spoke to reporters of being surveilled in her cell, of food tampering, of electromagnetic torture. During her last televised interview, she stared directly into the camera and said, "I'm being raped in the prison. They're using sonic pressure on my head." The words were fragmented, disjointed, not just a cry for help, but perhaps the echo of a mind no longer able to sustain its own internal logic. The prosecution framed her behavior as proof of instability. The defense called it the culmination of a lifetime of trauma and distortion, but even then, clarity remained elusive. Her execution took place in 2002. She declined a final meal. Her last words, "I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus," were cryptic, surreal, tinged with both religious imagery and cinematic bravado. They weren't the words of a woman seeking redemption. They were the words of someone who had long stopped speaking to the outside world. In the end, Wuornos didn't beg, apologize, or attempt to humanize herself. She remained inside the narrative she had built, the only structure left intact as everything else fell away. This final perception wasn't madness in the clinical sense. It was a mind closing in on itself, sealing every door. The complexity of this story doesn't end with Aileen Wuornos. If anything, her trajectory invites us to look inward, not in sympathy, but in serious psychological reflection. Her case was never just about murder. It was about transformation under pressure, the collapse of identity through sustained rejection, and the construction of a mental logic that made the unthinkable feel necessary. Her decisions were not isolated ruptures. They were the result of a deeply layered journey where emotional detachment and rage became the scaffolding for survival. The mind she carried into those crimes was not born at the moment of the trigger. It was shaped long before, in abandoned childhood bedrooms, in juvenile facilities, in jail cells, and on the side of highways where desperation became currency. Her story was not linear, not tidy. In the courtroom, she was portrayed as a deviant, in the media as a monster. But beneath all that was a fractured perception of the world, one that told her again and again that connection equaled danger and power came only through preemptive control. What makes this case echo long after her death is not the brutality of the acts themselves, but what they reveal about the human mind under siege. When trust is repeatedly broken, when identity is shaped by rejection, when survival becomes a performance rehearsed in isolation, what does it cost the psyche? Wuornos' story doesn't excuse anything, but it demands we pay attention to what precedes collapse, to the quiet signs, to the invisible shifts. Because every psychological descent has a beginning, and not all of them look like monsters at first. If this exploration stirred something in you, leave a comment below. There's always a hidden layer. If you've come this far, it means you don't just watch, you reflect. And that matters here. At Criminal Psychology Unmasked, we don't chase shock, we chase understanding. If this kind of exploration speaks to you, I invite you to subscribe and join us on this ongoing journey through the hidden corridors of the human mind. Each week, we enter a new case, a new psyche, a new set of questions that refuse easy answers. If you found value in this psychological deep dive, a like is more than appreciated. It's a signal that serious conversations about criminal behavior and mental transformation have a place here. And if a particular thought stayed with you, right below, the labyrinth never ends. Your insights keep this space alive, layered, and real. The human mind remains an endless labyrinth, and every case we explore only reveals how fragile the line between reality and darkness can be. In our next journey, we'll dive into another mind, shaped by forces just as hidden, just as powerful. I'll be waiting for you in the next video.